Greetings everyone, and welcome to this hour-long webinar which will be going on YouTube tomorrow, organised by Bridge India on India after the second wave of COVID. To introduce ourselves first, I'm a semi-retired foreign correspondent. I was in India for 25 years writing for the FT, The Economist, Fortune magazine and the New Statesman. I came back to London in 2018, having written a book on India called Implosion. And I now write a blog from London called Riding the Elephant. Professor Rajiv Gowda is a former member of the Rajya Sabha for Congress and a former economics professor at IIM Bangalore. He's now chairman of the Congress Party's research department and a national spokesman for the party, and he was the convener of the Manifesto Committee for the 2019 election. He's been a director on the Central Board of the Reserve Bank of India, so an intriguing mix of politics, academia, and public life. Welcome, Rajiv. Risha Bajpai, I'm going through the names in roughly the order they're going to be speaking the first time round. Risha Bajpai has an engaging story. After graduating from London Business School, she co-founded Goodera, a global technology platform that helps large corporates manage their CSR, sustainability, and volunteering initiatives. Last year, she founded Campus Fund, which invests in student-led startups across India. So good grassroots entrepreneurial stuff to come from you, Risha, welcome. Ajay Sethi is the founder and managing partner of ASA Associates, taxation, accounting and consulting firm that's grown over 30 years to 8 offices and over 700 employees, specializing in assisting companies from America, Japan, Britain and elsewhere to come and work in India. And Utkarsh Amitabh was a senior business development manager with Microsoft till last October, when he became CEO of Network Capital, one of the world's largest career intelligence companies, which he founded, and it now has a mind-boggling peer mentoring community of over 40,000 mentors in 104 countries. He's also part of a team that built India's first smart village and has written a bestseller, The Secretive Illusion of Hard Work, which argues rather happily that, that it's wrong to think that hard work alone can lead to success. What a great theme. Moving on to more serious matters and what we're here to discuss today, India after the second wave. It's now 15 months since the COVID pandemic hit India, and Narendra Modi famously introduced introduced a national lockdown at 4 hours notice on March the 24th, triggering economic hardship as millions of migrant workers flooded out of major cities. And then small firms and tiny businesses were hit hard. The economic growth, it's important to remember, had slumped to 4 to 5% before the pandemic hit, and eventually contracted over 2021 to by more than 7%. But India's people have escaped far less likely from the second wave than they did from the first, relative to the rest of the world. It's been harsh on all communities since February or March, and India has been shown to be ill-prepared for what was to come, and for what has been known internationally as the India strain, now renamed Delta. At its peak, as we all know, there were more than 400 cases a day being officially reported, and over 4,000 deaths. That figure today has come down to 62,000 cases and 2,500 deaths. But nobody believes those figures are actually real. And it's even more unknown now that the pandemic is spreading into the rural areas where healthcare is much worse, almost non-existent in many areas, and where the counting of deaths and cases will be often non-existent. So what I'd like to do, I ought to also add that as alongside the human suffering, India's also been hit as the world's largest producer of vaccines, which it's shown itself as a failure, and it's also hit its international image. There are signs that people are looking at India abroad and saying, well, if it can't manage this, if its politicians can't manage this, if its institutions can't manage this, is it a reliable partner as we go forward? We're not so much discussing that today, but I wanted to mention it. And what I'd like to do to begin with is to ask each of the speakers to give us an estimate of where they think we are now on cases. What are the real numbers? And how far is it eating into the villages? Just a brief description so that the audience knows the background at which we're going to have our discussion. Could I ask you, Rajiv, to start off on that?
Thank you, John. It's a very, very difficult question you asked us, because there's a lot of data that we don't have about what's happening in rural India. The official data that you quoted, essentially we are meeting at a time when things are looking up, or looking down, in the sense that that we are coming down from the peak, and 62,000 is much lower than the weekly average of over the last 1 week is about 77,000. So we are already on a way down from the peak. But one of the real challenges has been that the pandemic has spread into rural areas, as you pointed out, and there's a difficulty in terms of collecting data, in terms of identifying, the caseload, as well, as well as the positivity rate, as well as the, a number of deaths, and that the death rate is one of the bigger mysteries, because a large number of deaths are not being attributed to COVID. There, over the last few months, there have been what are called excessive deaths. The deaths, normally in any month, there are so many deaths that take place on average. And over the last couple of months, there have been, deaths which are, more than 1 lakh in magnitude more in each of these months. But these excess deaths are not necessarily allocated to COVID. They are attributed to various comorbidities, or basically to people, especially in rural areas, who say, oh, they just had a fever and died. Okay, so essentially we have a situation where the estimates vary from 5 times the number to 35 times the number, and this mystery is going to remain before all of us. All I can say is that we cannot declare victory. We cannot say that we are past the second wave. In fact, the title of our panel is about, beyond the second wave. We are not, I don't know when that happy moment will arrive, but yeah, that's where we are. We are actually facing great uncertainty in terms of how many people are infected, how many people are dying, and how to make policy in the face of this kind of uncertainty, with the range of possibilities in terms of the actual data.
And of course, people are now talking about a third wave, and there's also suggestions that might be a new mutant, which is being called Delta Plus. Richa, would you like to add at all? I mean, there's no need to, we can move on, but if you'd like to add anything, especially maybe, and I'd ask Utkarsh this as well, especially maybe in the rural areas, because I think that's the great mystery. We know that there's been undercounting in the urban areas. So Richa, have you some thoughts?
Yes, so just to add to what Professor Gowda said, that, it's actually very difficult to figure out the real numbers in the rural areas, and just not comorbidities. There have been other climatic things that have hit various states, like cyclones and things like that, because the rainy season is starting. So because of that, also some regions have been hit hard, right? And trying to figure out, what are the exact numbers for COVID, or for that matter, deaths overall, or the positivity rate, it's actually impossible, for the government or someone to try it, right? Because that kind of infrastructure just doesn't exist, right? Yeah.
Okay, yes. So, and Utkarsh, have you got any thoughts to add to this?
John, I just feel that it's time for us to really reflect what the new normal looks like. And you mentioned that Network Capital has 40,000 mentors. It's now 100,000. So, it's a little more over the pandemic. But one of the things that we are partners with Government of India's Niti Aayog, Atal Innovation Mission. And this mission hopes to spark creativity by producing mentoring and tinkering lab among schools. And in rural areas also, we're seeing that there's a lot more that needs to be done to get the students there in rural areas access to digital goods. While there is some progress because of the geofication of India and what have you, but I think as we look at the new normal, education, skilling, and community building is something that I focus on a lot.
We'll come on to that in a moment. Ajay, any thoughts on the figures, or do you just want to leave it with Rajiv and Rishabh's thoughts?
I'll just add one liner to the whole discussion. I think the numbers definitely would be different, but I think given the situation, and specifically look at the situation, let's take Delhi as an example. There were so many people who could not even get a test done because the test results were taking 1 week to come. And these kind of, so it's not, I think it's not just intentional. And on the flip side, I also know labs which were caught later on for fudging reports. So there has been a number of factors which are in play and could possibly give results. But whether it's 5 times, 35 times, I'll follow Rajiv. I mean, that will be a guesstimation. So I'll rather follow somebody who follows it more closely than me.
Fine. So let's move on to the main subjects that we're going to be discussing. I'm going to ask you, Rajiv, to start, and you're going to talk broadly for about 5 or 6 minutes on the broad economy, and then touch on politics.
All right, thank you, John. Well, first, actually, whatever the state of the numbers are, we must think also about the vaccination rate. The way to get out of this whole crisis is to vaccinate the population, or at least maybe 75% of the population to achieve some level of herd immunity. Once we reach that stage, then if everything falls into place, we can start to see the economy reviving again. However, the government has announced that they are going to achieve this goal of vaccinating about 100 crore of Indians by the end of this calendar year. And, if you look at the day, between the time of that announcement to today, there's already a deficit of how many people we need to, vaccinate on a daily basis to reach that goal. So there's a real crisis looming if we are not able to achieve that. And just on a side note, Delhi, Bangalore, where I am, all have started to unlock after some fairly stringent, recent lockdowns. And the behavior that we see is not very encouraging. There's a lot of people without masks. There's absolutely not enough social distancing. And so unless we can see a communication that changes people's practices, the precautions that they take, unlocking and hoping that the economy will revive will not necessarily happen, and we may end up facing a serious third wave as well. And that's really why the numbers that I'm going to talk about now in terms of the economy will, again, just like the case numbers, these numbers will also be guesstimates in a very, very significant way. So at least one number is not a guesstimate, which is the most recent GDP figures, which showed that the economy contracted by 7.3% over the last year. Okay, so basically, we have seen that unfortunately the economy was sliding downwards, or before the pandemic hit, and the pandemic has dealt a very, very cruel blow to the overall economic growth. Now, within that, right, on the one hand, you have some of our billionaires who have become multi-billionaires, but on the other hand, you have during the same period, India's vast informal economy that has suffered possibly very, very debilitating damage. And so because a lot of people who worked in the informal economy, in street vendors, people who worked in restaurants, a lot of people who tried to make a living as construction workers, etc., all of them really have not had work. They've had to go back to their villages. We saw after the first wave, the migrant crisis that really, we saw a padayatra of the poor, when they walked back thousands of kilometers to their homes. Luckily, there was the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which provided some amount of jobs and some amount of money to people. The government also did provide food and some amount of welfare. And so overall, we've been able to ride things out, but people are living on the edge. And that's the real concern going forward. Some of the other numbers that we talk about when we talk about the economy, is the industrial production picking up, is our exports picking up? Those things all depend on what was the base a year ago. And so it's not necessarily, very, very clear in terms of as indicators. But one thing we can say that the second lockdown that we've mostly been experiencing this year has not been as stringent in its impact as on the economy as the first lockdown. In the first lockdown, there was also a psychological impact of tremendous uncertainty, not knowing what the future held. We're not knowing whether vaccines would actually be discovered and whether those could be distributed in time. We didn't have any idea that everything would be moving forward at the pace that the breakthroughs would happen at the pace that they did. Okay, so essentially, we are now looking at a stage where if we are able to all take the appropriate precautions, then the unlocking can revive the economy and bring numbers back up. But the same challenges hold, which is that that there are some segments of the population, not just the informal economy, even a lot of people have have cashed in their retirement funds to be able to cope with daily life. People have been so the Provident Fund numbers tell us that we're seeing people spending less on food and nutrition, families. So there are all kinds of longer term impacts, and the job losses have been, again, CMIE is the only entity that is really, giving us information on a regular basis. The government, doesn't collect these data as frequently as it should. And, CMIE's data suggests that, again, 25 crore people are suffering from job losses or are otherwise affected. So basically, if we do unlock and things do improve, we will see some, improvement in the economy and growth will pick up again. But at the end of this whole process, you will find that we will be back in absolute numbers at where we were about 2 years ago in terms of the size of the economy. The Prime Minister keeps boasting about a $5 trillion economy target. Well, we are not even halfway there. We won't be halfway there when we recover from this pandemic.
Yes, I've been talking about the lack of distancing. There was a horrifying photo on the front page of the Business Standard this morning of a vegetable and fruit wholesale market in Jammu, and the people were crowded together as if it was 2 years ago. Absolutely no social distancing at all. And politics, I've got a question, and we're not really going on to questions. There is a question for you to tell us how Congress would have done it better. But leaving that aside until we'll come back to it if we have time, because it's not really why we're here. How do you see politics developing, around this? Stand back and be as independent as I am as a journalist and tell us what you think we're going to have in the next year or two.
So that's a tough one. I have been an academic, so I can.
Well, indeed, sorry, yes.
Yes,
and the RBI too.
So see, the fundamental issue is that many different kinds of politics at play. One is the government's tendency to view any criticism as anti-national or something like that. So the whole, the whole discourse is around how anyone who criticizes what's happening is fundamentally unpatriotic. Now, this is not the way politics should take place, and this leads to, this will lead to a suppression of, of sentiment, and you will see a lot more anger that will express itself in other ways, possibly at the next assembly elections in Uttar Pradesh, where people are basically saying, look, we're not able to criticize what the government has done, but we will find a way to teach them a lesson. So politics going forward is a situation which is very fluid. We are going to see state elections in a year's time, which will determine how angry people are and demonstrate how angry people are. But between those state elections and the 2024 general election, if the economy recovers, there will be a lot of propaganda about rising growth rates. There will be what they call the feel-good factor if things are actually improving, and people's anger would have been expressed at the state election level. And so it's not clear that that the incompetence that's been demonstrated over the last year would actually be would the people responsible would be held accountable at the polls. So that's the great uncertainty. That's part of the opposition's job, to convey that message. It's a very tricky moment to try and do that. Nobody wants to be pointing fingers. We want to make sure that we climb out of this as a nation. So that's the real challenge. Yeah.
And the first task, as you said, aside from the healthcare side and the distancing, is the economy, which was down at 4 to 5% in February last year. So even if the government manages, if policy and investment manages to recover it back to that point, that was still considered then to be totally inadequate, which sets up the scene, I think, Ajay, for you to come in now and tell us the attitudes and views of business and the prospects for recovery. What are you hearing from all your people?
So since we do a mixed bag, we deal with the Indian corporates as much as we deal with foreign corporates coming to India. So let's just start from the point where we talk about where is the second wave, what is the cause, what has it caused in the business community. So the first thing is this time it hit the urban mobile much harder than we had imagined last time. While last time it was more to do with migrants and labor and others who got, this time it hit everyone. And it particularly hit the business community because many businesses have lost their leaders. And don't forget, in India, we do follow a patriarchal sort of a structure in businesses. So if you lose a leader, you kind of lose the vision also, which of course is true in most SME segments in the world. The second thing is many vendors who are supplying have also lost their top leaders. And again, then you go down the chain, you have lost some very critical staff members. Now, all this, along with the fact that liquidity is low in the market and there is supply chain disruption, it causes a very strange phenomena, which Rajiv alluded about the fact that last time we kind of were ready. I mean, we were not ready, so there was an uncertainty. But this time, a new factor has come into play, which is a fear psychosis in the business community. Now, fear psychosis also causes risk aversion. And risk aversion is very bad for a country which wants to pull up and move very fast, because businesses are built on risk. So that's a factor which one needs to keep in mind. With that in perspective, let's look at the economic aspect of some of the things which have happened. Rajiv has also mentioned about job losses, and the numbers vary. Somebody's talking, 2 crores, somebody says 7 million. So these are numbers of job losses. Some are talking about 200 million people will go under the poverty line. These are numbers I have read, so I cannot, Rajiv can maybe later on comment about it, but there are job losses and there will be effects on the whole thing. One thing is coming out that the Indian wallet size was increasing. The spending power, earlier the basic necessities, what we were spending was approximately more than 60% we were spending. That position had started changing, and we had started going on non-necessary goods, which was nearly going to 60%. But suddenly in one particular year, we have had consumer spending directed towards healthcare primarily, and much more than your wallet allowed. The second aspect, which I think is going to hit us very hard, is that the bank defaults, the loan defaults are looking to be higher now. We are already 20% approximately higher than the last time of the same period. So bank defaults are going up. Third thing, getting raw materials is a big problem. Many of my clients have been telling about this thing. One is because of the localized lockdown. So if I'm, India is, we are part of the global village, but in India itself, we are part of connected to each other. So within India also, there's localized lockdowns which are stopping the supply chains. And not to forget that while we may decry China, China was a big supplier of components and raw materials to India. And that suddenly has also come to a halt. So what has happened I had a very peculiar situation I was discussing with one of my clients who last to last year started talking to me that, Ajay, I want to sell off my business. I do transactions. So I said, what is the issue which is on your mind? So he said, listen, I'm just not getting the orders because China is dumping what I'm making. So I said, fine. And then he got onto and he started pushing his business. And then last year, he's got a fantastic amount of orders. His order book is complete for the next 2 years. And again, he discussed with me that he wants to sell off his business. So I said, what is the issue this time? He says, actually, the cost of raw material has gone so high that my cost of production is more than my selling price, which I agreed on the order books. So you see, these are peculiar situations which COVID has created to some extent. So these are some of the issues, and some sectors are doing rather well. I mean, healthcare will do well, but hospitality won't. Aviation will suffer, and it will take many years for it to come back. But other sectors are doing. Education itself is in a tough spot, but online learning is not in a tough spot at all. It's in a fantastic zone. So I think with that in perspective, I'd like to just add two more things to the thought process so that it brings an entire picture. One is there still an India story? I mean, after having told you this rather difficult, is there still an India story? I think there is a fantastic India story because one, there is a high demand in India. You can't take away the demand factor. The aspiration and demand of Indian youth is still very high. And we see it growing at a tremendous pace. Number two, there is a China plus one, which is being talked about. G7 is talking about it, and the powers that be are talking about it. India, unfortunately, has cashed on it very well. The plus one is normally going off to Vietnam or Indonesia and Malaysia, and we need to get our act together onto that side, because manufacturing prowess of India is undeniably good, but we are not cashing on it very well. And not to forget, the last factor within this thing is there's a middle class. There is a growing middle class moving away, and which is growing, which was, let's say in Asia, 30% in 2010, if I remember the Brooklyn study correctly, which is going up to now 56% by 2025. Now, that is a growth. Of course, it's based on PPP, on purchasing power parity, but it's a fantastic story. And India within that is just after China. So there is an India story. But what do we need to get right before this India story explodes up? I think, in my opinion, the technology and manufacturing prowess of India needs to be better portrayed. I don't think our government is doing a fantastic job there. The second thing is there has to be easier and cheaper access to capital, because the SME segment is the backbone of any country, be it UK, anywhere in Europe, America. I think they need the help right now. I think that's something very critical. The third issue is faster land acquisition. You know, India has a problem of land, labor, and I mean, I'm sure Raji would have heard this many times. Land, labor, and logistics is the famous L3 word which we all hear about, and any conference I'm speaking about this comes up. But India better solve its land acquisition problem very quickly, because all the projects we do, if somebody sets up a factory of 10,000 or 3,000 workers, we start boasting about it. China on a routine basis sets up 3,000 or 10,000, don't even talk about it. So we need to get used to large projects. People want to set up bigger projects, but government has got to take direct initiative. The bureaucracy, fourth point, in my opinion, is bureaucracy has to be more agile and transparent. That part is still missing. Look, right now we were discussing about COVID numbers. While we did not point fingers anywhere, but we were alluding to something. So probably the bureaucracy needs to learn that, you know, the Indian masses are willing to take data, and we are willing to take decisions. We're willing to walk along. It's no more, that bad a situation where you need to take us as sheep which have to be herded along. I think the business community needs to embrace digital in a big way, and the government must do all efforts to encourage that. The sixth point, and probably the most important in my discussion, is infrastructure. I think the infrastructure aspect, the government needs to restart spending on that in a big way. And if within that, if I was to put finger, I would say healthcare and logistics, ports, roads, railways. I think that would be, if they push these areas, that would work very well. But in my closing comment, I would like to say that what is missing in India, and that is where one thing I think the government, they came out with a fantastic Make in India Progress plan earlier, which they started calling later Atmanirbhar Bharat. Now, Atmanirbhar Bharat means self-reliant India. But somewhere, like all things which a great idea can go bad. I think Atmanirbhar Bharat is a fantastic idea. And I think self-reliant is a wonderful word. But the way the world is absorbing it is being absorbed as self-focused India. And I think that's where the problem lies about the selling thing. And believe me, those who are getting it right, and there are two countries, Taiwan and France, they are very aggressive. Just yesterday, 4 Taiwanese companies have signed up to move into India, and I'm expecting 20 more. So I'm just leaving that thought that I think the projection has to be a bit better, and I'll leave it over to you now, John.
That was fascinating, but I don't have a sense at the end of it as to whether you're optimistic about the next year or two. You listed a lot of things that ought to happen, which were very interesting and important, and I want to come back to one or two of them. But are you worried about the next 2 years, or do you think that some of these things are going to be tackled? Because if the things you have mentioned are not tackled, then life looks pretty gloomy. Very briefly.
No, yes, I mean, to put it most briefly, I am personally very optimistic. Maybe not for the next 6 months to 9 months, but definitely in the long run, the fundamentals are clearly with India. And unless we really do something really, really stupid, I think India is in a fair direction.
And one thing which you mentioned earlier on, which I hadn't heard much about before, and I'd just like you to say a couple of words on it briefly, is the loss of leaders in companies and in industries, and people catching COVID not being around anymore. How widespread and how serious is that? Because that can be very hard to fill those gaps.
Yeah, actually, of course, on the bigger scales, we have lost some topmost leaders like Siddharth Shriram, very well-respected industrialist.
And a friend.
We have lost, and from the Suri family, Ramesh Suri in Delhi is gone. And like that, we have others. But see, these leaders were also managing mega empires. So they had fantastic leaders. But now you move to the SME segment and you move to the mid, forget the small, you even move in the mid. One leader more or less decides the entire functioning. So it might be 1,000 people organization or 400 people organization, but the vision, the push comes from that one single person. That person going at the age of 50, 56, when no succession has been decided, could leave things in limbo. And I think that is a big area. And many of these people are vendor suppliers to bigger organizations and multinationals. So that is the effect I was talking about, the disruption which comes from there.
Okay, thank you. Richa, can we come to you next? Your thoughts on the problems and the prospects for the poorest people, especially in rural areas, migrant workers.
Sure. So before I actually get into that, I have some points, just carrying forward what Ajay mentioned and Professor Gowda. The India story is very much there and intact, and just want to bring in some positivity in this whole discussion, as that the markets have been doing really well. Nifty has been soaring and it's been very bullish. 15,000 mark has been breached time and again. It's still above that. So there's some positive news. In between, the FIIs were withdrawing, but now again, it's come back to normal. Obviously, US rates and things like that are a major, have a major role to play in it. But overall, the markets have been really bullish. And it's going to continue like this for the next couple of months, which is a good positive news for the economy. Secondly, coming from the startup ecosystem, India has produced more than 20 unicorns already in this year.
Yes.
Right. And, one of the biggest unicorn is also, planning to go for its IPO and things like that. Right. So, and then many other startups will follow and things like that. And these startups are going to create the next slew of jobs in the country. Right. So that's also going to happen. And these startups are not only going to generate white collar jobs, but more and more blue collar jobs, right? Because, you have so many startups working in the logistics space, in door-to-door banking and things like that, right? So a lot of jobs are going to come as these startups grow and mature, right? So I would say that yes, there are issues, and if India does, things in the right direction, it will continue to grow, and the India story will not fade away until unless something stupid happens or the government does something. But I would also say that it is just not the responsibility of the government alone, right? This is a situation wherein the government, the corporates, the not-for-profits who are working at the grassroots, as well as all citizens need to do their bit, right? Only then the country can recover together, right? We just can't shrug away our responsibility saying that the government hasn't done it. It is not possible for the government to do it without getting all the players in the economy to contribute, right? So those were some of the points that I wanted to mention before I get into, the rural people and the poorest people.
That was a very good generational shift.
Yeah. I just wanted to, bring in some positive numbers in this whole discussion.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah. Also, with regards to the poor people, or, with regards to the migrant laborers and things like that, I think they were hit a little harder during the first lockdown, the first phase, because everything happened all of a sudden. They started moving, there was no arrangement and things like that. It was better managed in the second lockdown phase. And I think, there have been a lot of support given by the government in terms of ration, in terms of food supply and things like that. Now the vaccination is also being made free and things like that, so that it is not, leading to any black market sort of activities, with regards to vaccine and stuff. Secondly, the corporates have also realized, corporate India also needs to support the migrant laborers and the people who are working with them, who are on daily wages, right? So a lot of corporates, a lot of conglomerates like the Tatas, the Mahindras, Godrejas and all have been very considerate to actually let their let such workers be. Even if the factories were shut down and things like that, they ensured that the salaries are being given, their kin are being taken care of and things like that. So as I'm saying, the solution to come out of this is not one stakeholder's duty. It is the duty of all the stakeholders to come together. Secondly, as everybody knows, the informal economy, there are more than 500 million workers in the informal economy. It's like the SMEs contribute to more than 50% of the GDP of the country, right? So obviously they've been hit hard because of the lockdown and things like that. But a lot of grassroots charities, like for example, there is Seva, who's been specifically working to support the women laborers, right? Because they've been hit much harder than the male laborers and things like that. So there's a lot of action happening on the ground to support, the poorer people, the laborers and the migrant workers and things like that. So I would say I would see this in a positive light. I mean, there are two sides of a coin, right? You can look at it from a gloomy eye, or you can look at it from a positive lens. I would, try and look at it from a positive lens, because what I feel is that in this whole period of lockdown, it's the second year running, people have got time to reflect, right? And they've started realizing what matters, as a corporate, what matters to you as an individual and things like that. And they've been more forthcoming in helping people, small little things like helping your maids at home, and things like that. So I think the good side of humanity has come out. And that's why I say that, yes, the situation is not perfectly fine at this point in time on the ground. In rural area, even so, more difficult, because there's lack of health facilities, lack of infrastructure, road and railways, they are not accessible at times and things like that. But And there are certain rumors also being spread, that you shouldn't be taking the vaccine and things like that. It'll cause you another problems and stuff like that. So there are challenges, but there are positive moves as well. So that's why I'm saying, if all the stakeholders work together, even the poorest of the poorest can come out of this, right? I mean, that's what my take would be, is actually.
There's one comment question which makes the point that bullish markets are not positive news if new investment is abysmal across industry. Startups don't create as many new jobs as those that have been lost, which of course is a fair comment. But are you finding your campus fund deals with student startups?
Right.
Despite the lockdown and all the problems that students have had, is the student startup, which is indicative of how the very young people just coming into the working world, how they're reacting? What's your experience?
Right. No, so just one point, that yes, startups do not contribute like a significant portion of the employment numbers in India, but that's going to change in the future, like in other economies. So I think startups are going to boom in this country, and they are going to create the next wave of employment, not only white collar, but blue collar, because, startups are now moving from India to Bharat. They are building.
But are the students, is the students active?
Yes, yes. You will be surprised, because of COVID, because of lockdown, the digital divide has reduced significantly. Everybody, whether they like it or not, have been pushed onto digital platforms, right? And because of the digital divide, a lot of students, not only in the tier 1 cities, in the tier 2, tier 3 cities, are using technology and solving problems for those local areas. So in fact, there has been a lot of innovation on the usage by these students of technology. They are using technology to build new startups, and that's a positive.
Good. Okay, thank you. Utkarsh, you've been very patient sitting there with that splendid backdrop. Are you actually in a garden, or is it a permanent backdrop? You're going to deal with young entrepreneurs, the future of startups, which we've just been talking about, and mentoring issues. And also, as you mentioned to me in an email, and we haven't really discussed it yet, the broad area of education and how much, especially primary education, where in some cities, I think schools have been shut for a very long time. So explore that area.
Thanks, John. I've read your books and your blog. Great to finally be chatting with you. I don't know if you remember.
Thank you.
Met with Dr. Tharoor briefly at one of his launches.
Oh, right. Yes, yes.
So very brief background. I left Microsoft last year in the middle of the pandemic to commit full-time to a side hustle that I was working on for many years. And that side hustle essentially is what I do. And I am actually really motivated, John, by this whole movement towards passion economy, where people who either decided in the middle of the pandemic to leave their jobs, or who've been fired, or perhaps they changed their life plans, were using digital platforms to monetize their skills, their creativity, their innovations. Richa alluded to some of them earlier. And I'm a living, breathing example of that passion economy. And I see that the number of job losses that have happened, I think world over, there's been about 500 million. In India, depending on which figure and facts do you believe, the numbers anywhere ranging between 30 million to 60 million. I mean, it's hard to verify, but the number is really high. And I don't think these jobs are coming back. I don't think startups will be alone. Startup hiring will take care of that, or government can do something immediately to get those jobs back. So what do people do in this year or two of pain that's coming? I think people will have to learn to figure out what they're uniquely good at and use the digital tools which are available to, create a living for themselves. And I looked at this recent passion economy report that my company Network Capital put together. There's a lot of positive momentum, both from Bharat as well as from India. It's also age agnostic. People who've been fired a lot, or people who've lost jobs or decided to quit, are disproportionately millennials, like, people who are, say, 35, 36 or under, And I think that there's this shift that's happening in the way we look at work. And I think this shift is here to stay. I think when you look at education, so for most of the last year and a half, education has been happening like this webinar is happening on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or any of those digital platforms. And while for information sharing, this is fine, but I don't think it's a suitable replica for a real engaged classroom. So as we march into the future, I really hope that the community aspect, which has been taken away from the lives of students, even from professionals, is complemented as we recreate what the new normal looks like. And I think when we look at the startup ecosystem in India, we often talk about what's happening in ed tech, education technology. But if we really reflect, we'll see that the innovations that have happened in ed tech, unfortunately, have been restricted to test prep. And I think education in the post-pandemic world needs to be a lot more about really sparking wonder and curiosity, not just about how people are learned to ace examinations. And I think as we really figure out what the movement looks like in that space, the role of community in the education space becomes a lot more important, over and above complementing, of course, the student learning gaps and other things that exist. And lastly, I think in the post-pandemic world, I love this mental model by Ray Dalio, pain plus reflection equal to progress. And I think India has suffered a lot of pain. The world has suffered a lot of pain, but we shouldn't try to sweep it under the rug or just pretend that it never happened. I think we really need to create a scenario where we reflect on some of the really defining things, healthcare, education, skilling, and see how we can use the digital tools, how we can use the pain that we've suffered, and work with the government, work with the private sector, work with the opposition, the startups, all, because we're all in this together. This pandemic has united us in our suffering. And I really feel that as we march into the future, I approach it at least with cautious optimism. I'm not going to say that I'm super excited or super pessimistic. I think if we reflect properly, take actionable steps, we'll get there.
Good, thank you. Let's move on to the health sector, because that is the area which has suffered, which people have suffered from the most over the past months. Rajiv, with your party hat on, if you like, if you were writing a policy brief for what should happen to the health sector, let's get into criticisms of what has or hasn't happened, but what would you change? What would you change in terms of state government responsibilities, local responsibilities, how to get health centers cleaned up and operating properly? It's down in the village as well as up in Delhi, and also the role of the private sector. We've only got, I'm afraid, about 12 minutes. So if we can spend somehow 3 or 4 minutes on that, I thought of coming to you and then to Richa on that one.
Okay, well, massive investment in health infrastructure, from the village level right up to the taluka, to the district level, because what we need is better access, massive investment in people, because we need many, many, many more people who can be paramedics and even get involved in delivery of and access to healthcare. And the other aspect is on the organizational side, decentralization in such a manner that would allow empower healthcare professionals to go out and reach the people. For example, you can't sit and wait for them to come to your center for vaccination. You should be going out there like we've done with mega vaccine programs earlier. We should be going out to the public and to every village. And then at the same time, investment in technology, because telemedicine, and maybe there are other transformative possibilities that exist out there that that can actually create better access and better inclusion when it comes to coping with healthcare.
Okay, so let's suppose you write the policy, you're in government. How long do you think it would take for that to be implemented? A year, 2 years, 5 years, a decade? And how quickly will people lose enthusiasm and go off and do something else?
No. See, health has been massively underinvested. Underinvested in health. In every manifesto, regardless of party, we say we will spend, 6% of GDP on healthcare. But as a matter of fact, government spending tends to be less than half of that.
But how quickly could you generate the investment and the organization to actually change it on the ground?
I think it would be a 5-year project. Even in a crisis situation, I don't see that much reallocation.
Richard, you're our optimist person on today, or the leading optimist. Answer the same question. Can things change? Will everybody just drift back to how it used to be? What would you do?
Right. So, when specifically coming to healthcare, obviously, as Professor Gowda said, there has been significantly less investment over the years, right? So to get the health infrastructure right across the breadth and lengths of the country, it's a very Herculean task is what I would say, right? But it will have to be done, in collaboration with, the corporates, and I would say startups as well, and with a lot of use of technology. And decentralization is key for something like this. So I think as India recovers, hopefully, we should, as the government and other players in the ecosystem, should focus on getting the basic pillars of the country right. So healthcare as an investment area needs to be relooked at. And more investment, significant investments need to be made, not only in the tier 1 cities, but across the depths of the country, because we've realized how it can impact life after seeing the pandemic, right? Secondly, education and upskilling. So I would sort of agree to what Utkarsh has said here, that education is key. The way education is going to happen in the future needs to be changed. It cannot be rote learning anymore. I think the national education policy that came in 2020 emphasized on a lot of things which shift the Indian education methodology from rote learning to more experiential learning. And then upskilling or reskilling for people at all stages of their life from all the corners of the country is very much required, right? So I think a lot of these changes need to be brought in by the government at the policy level, and then further, in collaboration with the state governments and the corporate houses, this needs to be delivered, in the rural areas, in the semi-urban areas. Urban areas, I think, will take care of themselves. But I think the way, we've looked at, some of these things will have to be changed. And I would say health, education, and, upskilling or empowerment, we'll have to change the way we look at it. And that's how, we will be able to recover and grow with the same strength and fulfill the ambitions of India as a country. So that would be my approach, for recovery.
Ajay, any thoughts on that? And then moving on to the other subject I wanted to touch on, which is migrant workers. There must be a better way of running India than having millions of migrant workers in the urban centers. Do your clients see a different way of doing it? Have they learned a lesson in the last year? Did they learn a lesson last March that life really that their workforces ought to be differently organized?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was no lesson to be learned. I think the fact is that this calamity, it hits anybody. It's very difficult to plan around this calamity. So I think, but I think many of my clients, and I think generally business people, did reach out to their workforce. It's not that they neglected it. And of course, there was massive fear, and there was massive fear in the workforce, which is also restricted. And I think the government tried its best, and the workforce was well taken care of. But I'll move one step forward.
I wasn't questioning that. I was thinking about going forward, whether the
So I'll come to that. Yeah, I'll come to that straight away, John. I can see that you would like me to give quick answer now. The new labor codes, because India has had this perennial problem about labor and the laws around labor. We have had, the variety of laws and, 29 laws, and each law is not talking to each other. So what a definition of a worker was sitting in X was different in both. And you could end up getting penalized in one law and being praised in other. Now, these have been reduced to 4 labor codes. And I think these are very good. Without going into details, we have been doing a lot of knowledge sessions for our clients. But I think the labor code wise, the government has got it absolutely correct. They have got the right things. What is a worker, what is not, women rights, retrenchment policies, disposal of things, how long will it take to get a trade union to be formed, what the trade union can do and cannot do, and who will negotiate with the employers. I think finally we have a fantastic labor code. Of course, how it is implemented now, once it gets notified, lies the real test. But I think that would take care of the question, what you asked me, much better than me kind of giving you guesstimates on what is possible.
We've had a question about the government's announcement on vaccinations, and I'm going to direct this to you, Ajay, first, I think. Can industrial activities, by which they mean businesses, detach themselves from the vaccination prerogative, given the high risk which one already runs by waiting for the promise of vaccination? I think the point of the question is, should companies take over a role in vaccinating?
Definitely yes. And to answer that, the companies are deeply involved in it. I hardly know any organization which is not involved in it, right from offices of professional services firms like us, down to small businesses, down to shopkeepers. Because see, if I'm going to allow a person, a vendor, to come to my office, I'm not going to allow him without a vaccination certificate. Same applies everywhere. So I think that, as a matter of fact, everybody is involved. I mean, I'll be surprised if somebody wants to be left out and be called that this guy is not putting money where his mouth is. So I think people are involved.
And we've got a question which I'd like you to take, Utkarsh, about can the startup ecosystem, as well as big companies, take it on themselves to execute training programs for industry freshers, to teach them how to upskill now while they go through the next many months of unstable job market?
I think they need to, and also some upskilling needs to come from individuals' own will. We all need to learn new things. Back in the day, much before I was born, at least my parents' generation was study for 4 years, then work for 40. Now, every 4 years, you have to learn a new skill. Now, you can't really expect somebody else to do this for you. You have to be motivated yourself, but companies and startups both have a strong role to play in that. If you want to see Germany, the way they've implemented the internship program, the skilling program, not everybody needs to go to college, but everybody needs to have a skill, and people need to reinvent themselves multiple times in their careers. So there's a strong role to play. And for startups, they're already building stuff to create what the workforce for the 21st century looks like. There are coding boot camps, but we need to do a lot more than coding boot camps. We need to inculcate a sense of wonder, and most importantly, community-oriented learning. A company that I invested in recently creates these cohort-based courses. And I believe that cohort-based courses combined with communities of the future will create this new normal for learning. And I think companies will pick up some parts of it. The startups will pick up some part of it. The government hopefully will pick up some part of it. And the remaining people will have to, work with their own friends, families to figure out learning systems where they can improve a little bit better and get a little bit better and find their market fit with whatever job to pursue.
Right, we're almost on our time. I'm not sure whether we actually get cut off at 6 o'clock my time or what, but quickly, one line each, starting off with you, Utkarsh, since you've got the microphone, so to speak. Positive or negative for the next year or so?
Cautiously optimistic.
Ajay?
I feel optimistic about the market after 6 months.
Professor Gowda?
Unless the government really puts in a lot of resources into taking care of those who've been displaced and hurt, we're not going to be positive in terms of outcomes.
And Richard, positive from you to finish the session.
Yes, optimistic. We will come out of this together as a nation. That's what I believe. And it's just not one stakeholder. All stakeholders need to come together.